Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Best on Wellbeing podcast. Today, I'd like to discuss the very kind of gentle notion of being lighthearted. One of my favorite sort of images or concepts in terms of religious ideas is from ancient Egyptian mythology that would say that if you were to enter the gates of heaven, at the gates of heaven, in order to enter heaven, they would weigh your heart against with those kind of old school scales, and they would weigh your heart against a feather. And if your heart was as light as a feather, then you could enter heaven. And obviously, I'm not saying this is a literal thing. My interpretation would be that when we talk about heaven, I would view it as very high levels of well-being. um, Maybe one in a subsequent episode we can conjecture about these concepts of the afterlife, but right now, if we stay kind of grounded in the here and now of our earthly existence, I would say that the idea of heaven is, yeah, very high levels of well-being, to be able to experience well-being relatively consistently in our day-to-day lives, which doesn't need to be perfect. And here, when we talk in this podcast about these ideas, it's not about doing it perfectly. It's about moving in a direction of greater well-being. That even if we shift, let's say, 1%, that's a huge win. So I don't want people, if they listen to this, to think that when I make some suggestions, which again are very applicable, that I don't always succeed to apply to my life. It's not about being perfect. It's about moving in a certain direction towards greater well-being. So when we talk about heaven, in this context, this sort of imagery of being as having a heart that's as light as a feather, it really comes to the notion of being very lighthearted. That the more we become lighthearted, the more we are experiencing well-being. And therefore, the work that needs to be done, or what we need to apply ourselves to, is the idea of reducing or removing that which makes us heavy, that which makes the heart heavy. We covered a little bit of this in the idea of loving kindness energy, but a huge part of what makes our heart heavy is sometimes resentment, um, inability to forgive, chronic frustration with the world, with people, with things like that. And so I would use the word resentment. That resentment is very heavy. It makes the heart heavy. And so if we can proceed to releasing these pockets of resentment that are within us, then our heart becomes more light and we can live with more well-being. So the question comes with, well, how do we go about releasing our resentments? And there's a few things here to discuss, because resentment can also be kind of a chronic anger towards, it doesn't need to be this like necessarily this out of control anger, but just sort of like a persistent anger towards something, a person, a situation that, there's different words. Like we said, it's tricky, but anger, resentment, it's kind of all the same thing. These sort of pockets of negative emotions that are long standing and kind of difficult to get at. And so, one thing to begin with when we talk about releasing resentment is to just recognize that perhaps we're indulging in anger or resentment. We talked about previously the difference between well being and pleasure. And, I've noticed many times in my life, sometimes if I get into kind of like a negative, resentful sort of mindset, that it's kind of weird. It kind of feels good a little bit. It's this almost like a drug. You give yourself a little hit of that justification why you ought to stay mad, why you ought to stay resentful to that situation or person. And it kind of feels good to just indulge in it. But as we know naturally, things like that, drugs that provide pleasure without an undertone of well being, generally weaken us and hurt us. And we know that, for example, it's kind of like, this is a bit extreme here, but I go back to the heroin addict that would say, well, why would I give up heroin? Because it feels good. you know, but it's perhaps it's feeling good when at certain moments, but ultimately it's hurting and destroying his entire being and system. And I think excuse me, I think resentment has a lot of that similar kind of concept, that sometimes letting our mind go there and say, oh yeah, like I should be mad. I that person or that situation, this is unacceptable, or this or that in the government. And there's all sorts of things we come up with that. And then we let ourselves just be mad and frustrated. And, you know, and it kind of feels good, but it still feeds that pocket of resentment that ultimately weighs upon our hearts and weighs upon us, and ultimately is detrimental to well-being. And so therefore, if we can just start by recognizing that this is an indulgence that we have, this is something we take pleasure in doing, that we know that if we can just recognize that, even though it can have these moments of pleasure when we let ourselves be angry or whatever, we can just recognize that it's possibly not good for us. Number two would be, like I said in a previous podcast, to begin the process of deliberately trying to wish a situation or a person, a group, whatever it is that we're resentful to wish it well, to send loving kindness energy. Okay, that can begin the process of undoing these pockets of resentment. And third is also the idea of trying to understand where other people, other situations, the big context of why governments do what they do. Like there's a lot to look at in terms of trying to understand why people, groups, situations behave the way they do. And rather than just being constantly frustrated, we try to understand it. And that can begin the process of starting to release the resentment and make us more lighthearted, to just let people be the way they are. And one thing I'll say as well is, this process is not about the other person. It's always comes back to our own internal experience. Like, you can literally be in a situation where you have to take somebody to court because they, I don't know, they stole $50,000 from you. And that's not, it's okay. Like, it's not okay to just say, okay, well, I'm not going to do anything. Everything's fine. I'm going to be lighthearted. Of course not. You're going to go through a process, and for the greater good, because if you don't make efforts to stop this person, then perhaps more people will have the same trouble. So you go through the difficult process of court and lawyers and retrieving your money. And so you do all the necessary things, but on the internal process, you can still begin to work at releasing the resentment towards that person for your own well-being. That, you know, they're confused, their own lives are full of confusion, you know, maybe come from a generation of antisocial behaviors. There's all sorts of ways to try to understand why people misbehave and do very unkind things. But when we hold on to resentment and indulge in anger, maybe too much, ultimately it hurts us. It hurts our well-being. It makes our heart heavy. And when I share this sort of discussion, again, this is not about a perfection of just like, oh, you know, I'm going to release all my frustration. It's released. I'm happy. I'm perfect. I'm lighthearted. No. Like, let's be real here. But this is about moving in that direction, little by little, just moving in that direction of realizing that whatever pocket of resentment that we have, to applying ourselves to releasing it step by step by step, in order to have a heart that's as light as a feather, that allows us to enter the kingdom of well-being, if you will. Anyways, that's it for today, folks. I hope you have a good day. We'll see you next time.